The Cinder hegemony had a zero-tolerance policy on theft, and they expressed it with plasma cutters and heavily armored feet. Stroboscopic red emergency lights swept across Scott Schmidt's face, painting the bridge in rhythmic pulses of panic he refused to feel. The deck beneath his worn boots vibrated with a deep percussive rhythm, the brutalist drumbeat of a forced boarding. The air, once recycled and tasting faintly of machine oil and brewed calf, was now charged with the biting scent of superheated circuitry and the acrid smoke of the breached airlock. He was moving, his voice a low, gravelly command that cut through the shrill symphony of the alarms. "They're on board!" Even as he spoke, Galileo was already gone from his co-pilot station. The big man moved with a weight and purpose that seemed to defy the ship's artificial gravity. The heavy repeater he favored already, unslung from its magnetic clamps and cradled in his thick arms as he thudded toward Corridor C. Finch, a fluid line of movement, was already launching herself over the navigation console in a single vaulting motion that was more acrobatic than military. Her target, the maintenance hatch overhead. She moved like a startled bird, all sharp angles and sudden grace. "Cora, status report, now!" Only Corina Valeray, Cora, remained at her post, her back to the chaos. Her hands moved with deliberate, focused speed across her holographic console, not in a blur, but in a series of interlocking gestures. Her right hand keyed in a diagnostic command sequence, pulling up the signature of the vessel latched onto their hull like a parasite, while her left isolated the cutter's transponder signal, peeling back layers of encryption that were more suggestion than security. She didn't need to be told what to look for. "It's Cinder hegemony, Scott. Gotta be." Her voice was a cascade of dry sarcasm, a familiar defense against the adrenaline flooding her system. "One of their Claw-class patrol cutters docked hard and blew the airlock. They're not asking for permission to come aboard." She traced a finger across the glowing schematic of their ship, highlighting the angry red icons swarming in from the docking tube. 50-plus life signs, all big ones. They're really rolling out the welcome wagon for us." "They want their ship back," Scott stated, grabbing his pulse rifle from its mag clamp on the wall. The weapon felt like a familiar extension of his arm, its weight a comforting anchor in the unfolding storm. "More than that, they want the nav data we pulled from it." He slammed a power cell into the rifle's housing, the sharp, definitive click echoing the closing of a tomb. "They can't have either." The ship shuddered again, the groan of stressed metal and tortured support beams echoing up through the deck plates. A fresh wave of percussive booms, heavier and more rapid this time, told him Galileo had made contact. The dull, heavy thumps of his repeater were answered by the high-energy crackle of plasma discharges. The firefight was a losing proposition, and Scott knew it. He didn't need Cora's readouts to understand the grim arithmetic of their situation. Corridor C was a kill box, a straight shot of gray decking and exposed conduits, barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast. The hegemony enforcers were brutes in exoskeletons of black, bioforged plate that mimicked the layered texture of volcanic rock, their bodies bred and conditioned for war. But it was their eyes that gave them the supreme advantage. They possessed 4 of them. 2 forward-facing, protected by recessed sockets, provided focused, binocular vision. 2 more, set wider apart on their flat skulls, provided a near-panoramic field of view. All 4 were biological masterpieces of thermal imaging. They saw the world in heat. A freshly fired weapon was a blazing beacon. The searing line of a plasma bolt was a beautiful, unmissable lance of pure energy. The thermal signature of a warm-blooded human, silhouetted against the cool metal of a corridor, was a perfect stark white target against a dark gray canvas. They didn't aim at shapes, they aimed at life itself. Galileo was a bulwark of defiance. He'd braced his heavy repeater against a support strut, the weapon stock tucked tight against his shoulder, and was laying down furious waves of suppressive fire. Each explosive shell that spat from the barrel lit the corridor in a flash of kinetic violence, But more importantly, it superheated the barrel of his weapon, turning him into a flare in the hegemony's vision. They didn't need to aim for him. They could aim for the glowing source of heat he held. "They're walking right through it, Scott!" Finch's voice, tinny and strained, crackled over their private comms from the vents above. Her perspective was unique, a top-down view of the battle rendered in the ghostly greens and blacks of her own thermal imager. "Their shields are dispersing the heat from the impacts. I can see the energy bloom and ripple across their armor, but it's not penetrating. I can't get a clean shot at a vital point from up here. Too much thermic plating." A bolt of brilliant blue plasma slammed into the wall inches from Galileo's head, leaving a molten, white-hot crater that sizzled on the hegemony's vision, a temporary sun in the gloom. The air hissed thick with the scent of vaporized metal. He didn't flinch, just adjusted his aim, his movements economical and tight, and sent another volley downrange. "Getting crowded," was his only comment, his voice a low rumble that was felt as much as heard. "Finch, get back!" Scott ordered. "I can—" she started, but her protest was cut short by a deafening shriek of tearing metal directly over the comms. A hegemon enforcer, having pinpointed her heat signature through the grate, had punched its fist straight through the ventilation shaft. Finch yelped as the massive three-fingered hand, glowing with its own body heat like a brand, clawed at the empty space where she'd been a half-second before. Metal curled and tore around the intrusion. "Falling back!" she hissed, her bravado finally cracking, replaced by the sharp edge of genuine fear. "Galileo, pull back to the bridge, that's an order!" Scott shouted, firing a 3-round burst to cover his friend's retreat. The round sparked uselessly off a shimmering energy shield that flared to life around the lead hegemon. The enforcer didn't even slow down. They were a tide of black armor and searing heat, systematically, inexorably pushing them back. The rogue star was small. There wasn't much left to fall back to. They scrambled onto the bridge, the air now thick with the metallic tang of ruptured power conduits and the thin, sharp smell of fear. Scott slammed his hand on the control panel beside the doorway. A heavy blast door, scarred and pitted from a dozen other desperate moments, groaned shut, sealing them in. For now. A series of thunderous thuds hammered against it almost immediately, each one shaking the entire deck. They were trapped. "Well," Cora said, not looking up from her console, her focus absolute. "This has escalated. I'm detecting shape charges being placed on the door. I give us 90 seconds before we're redecorating in hegemon guts and blasted bulkheads." Scott ignored her gallows humor, his eyes scanning the schematics flickering on the main view screen. Power conduits, life support, substation links. He wasn't looking for a way out. He was looking for a weapon. A voice, deep and guttural and dripping with a contempt so profound it felt oily, boomed from the ship's internal comms. The hegemony commander had patched into their system. It was him, Harith. "You vermin hide in your metal can, cowering from the inevitable. Did you truly believe you could steal from the cinder hegemony and live? Your little prize is forfeit. Your lives are forfeit." There was a pause, filled with the smug, unshakable certainty of a predator who has cornered its prey. "What hope do you have against us, with your pathetic, weak, human eyes?" Scott's lip curled into a humorless smile. His gaze locked onto a single, blinking icon on the schematic, the main power trunk connecting their docking bay to Terminus Station's Sector Epsilon substation, an old, notoriously unstable piece of hegemony hardware they had been forced to interface with upon docking. An idea, cold and ugly and beautiful, bloomed in his mind. "Weak eyes," he murmured. "Cora," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm that made the hair on Galileo's arm stand up. "The substation. You told me it had a sloppy back door to the primary capacitor banks." Cora looked up, the usual sarcasm in her eyes replaced by a dawning comprehension. "Yeah, but Scott, that's not a switch. It's a sledgehammer. A full unregulated surge from those banks. It would cascade through the entire sector grid. The station's regulators would never hold it." "What would it do to their vision?" he pressed, cutting her off. "They see heat, high-contrast thermal signatures. What happens when every active system goes cold? When the only things left are residual heat signatures, all blurring together into a meaningless low-contrast soup." Her eyes widened, the last vestiges of sarcasm draining from her face as she fully grasped the insane brilliance of it. A thermal whiteout! A fog! With no hotspots, no sharp temperature gradients to give the world shape. Their organic vision would be useless. It couldn't process the low-contrast environment. It would be like trying to read a white page printed with white ink. She paused, her mind racing, calculating the secondary and tertiary effects. But a surge that big, Scott, it's not just a blackout. It'll throw a massive electromagnetic pulse, a dirty one, full of chaotic frequencies. It'll fry anything with a delicate microsensor. That includes their fancy integrated optics, their comms, and the station's entire centralized emergency lighting grid. "But not our gear," Scott stated. A savage, almost feral grin spread across Cora's face. "Our gear? Half of it is pre-collapse military surplus. It's built like a brick shithouse. The thermal imagers are practically analog, shielded to hell and back, robust, reliable, and too damn dumb to be fried by a simple EMP." She let out a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, this is ugly. This is really, really ugly. I love it." "They're blind without the fire," Scott said, his voice flat and hard. He turned to Galileo, whose massive hand was resting on the hilt of the combat knife sheathed on his vest. "Kid, remember the Academy sims? The ones they ran on xenoanatomy?" Galileo's dark eyes met his. A flicker of understanding passed between them. "Respiratory vents," he grunted. "Under the curve of the lower jaw, soft tissue. And the primary arm joint," Scott added, "where the limb meets the torso. Thinner plating. A knife goes in clean." "No mistakes," Galileo confirmed, giving a single sharp nod. The movement was small but carried the weight of a blood oath. The first of the shape charges on the door detonated with a deafening crack, sending a spiderweb of glowing fractures across the blast door's surface. The metal groaned in protest. The next one would bring it down. Scott looked at Cora. His face was set like a stone, his eyes chips of ice. It was the look he got right before he did something terrible and necessary, a look that promised violence not of passion, but of cold, hard logic. "They think we're running for cover," Scott said, his voice a low whisper in the sudden ringing quiet between explosions. "They think we're trapped prey. They're wrong." He locked his gaze on Cora, who was staring back at him, a wild, terrified, exhilarating light in her eyes. "Harith was right about one thing," Scott said, the words sharp and clear in the tomb-like stillness. "They called human eyes weak, until we cut the power and hunted them in total darkness." He gave a sharp nod. Cora didn't need another command. A grim, fierce smile spread across her face. She slammed both hands down on her console, a gesture of pure, gleeful defiance. On the main screen, a river of angry red code poured into the substation schematic. A feedback loop warning flashed once, twice, then was consumed by the surge. There was no explosion, just a deep, mournful groan that seemed to emanate from the station's very bones. The emergency lights on the bridge flickered, buzzed with an agonizing indecision, and died. The thrum of the ship's systems, the constant, subtle vibration under their feet, that was the station's heartbeat, ceased. The air grew still, the temperature already beginning to drop. They were plunged into a darkness so complete it felt like a physical weight, a pressure on the eyes and ears. A few distant battery-powered emergency signs flickered on down the corridors, but their weak, isolated light only served to create more confusing shadows, doing nothing to illuminate the oppressive black. The EMP wash was silent, invisible, and utterly devastating. The hunt had begun. From Commander Harith's perspective, the world dissolved. One moment, he was observing the glorious breach, his four eyes drinking in the sharp, beautiful heat signatures of his soldiers, poised to storm the bridge, their bodies blazing white against the cool gray of the corridor walls. The next, Reality itself smeared into an incomprehensible, nauseating mess. All definition, all contrast, all meaning was gone. His specialized eyes were suddenly his worst enemy. They were flooded with a swirling, useless fog of low-grade thermal data. The afterglow of a plasma crater on the wall was a meaningless splotch of indistinct warmth. The cooling body of a dead human was a vague, disappearing smear. The residual heat of a console, the bulkhead, the very air, it all blended into a swirling, featureless miasma. He could see heat everywhere, and therefore he could see nothing at all. He was blind. Functionally, terrifyingly blind. A high-pitched squeal from his helmet's integrated comms, followed by an abrupt and total silence, confirmed the EMP. They were cut off from their ship, from each other, from everything. A guttural snarl of confusion and rage ripped from his throat. "Status! What is happening?" His enforcers were just as lost. He could hear their disoriented grunts, the clumsy, heavy scrape of their armored boots on the deck. They were 8-foot giants, armed to the teeth with weapons that could slag a small moon, and they were stumbling like newborn infants. On the bridge of the Rogue Star, the 4 humans were moving with silent, predatory grace. Scott felt the familiar click as he flipped down the thermal imaging rig over his eyes. The world resolved itself in a stark, high-contrast monochrome of whites, grays, and blacks. From the outside, the active lenses cast a faint, eerie green glow across his face, a phantom light in the profound dark. To his imagers, which translated minute temperature differences into clear images, the 37°C warmth of a living hegemon was a brilliant, white-hot silhouette against the cool, dark gray backdrop of the powerless ship. He saw them perfectly. 3 enforcers, just outside the ruined blast door, turning in confused circles. Their bodies were blazing beacons of life in a dead gray world. He tapped Galileo on the shoulder. Galileo nodded, his own imager active, his face also bathed in that faint, ghostly green light. He held his combat knife in a reverse grip, the blade pointing down his forearm. They moved as one, stepping over the buckled threshold into the corridor. Their soft-soled boots made no sound on the deck. Scott closed the distance to the nearest hegemon. The giant was muttering in its harsh, clicking tongue, one massive, gauntleted hand outstretched, feeling for a wall that was 2 feet to its left. Scott raised his suppressed pulse rifle, the weapon's targeting laser invisible to all but his own optics, and placed the glowing dot on the soft respiratory vent under the massive jaw. A single, muffled thump. The hegemon's head snapped back. A choked, wet gasp was the only sound it made. Its brilliant white silhouette flickered, then sagged, collapsing to the deck with a heavy, fleshy thud that was shockingly loud in the stillness. The second hegemon spun toward the sound, its plasma rifle swinging wildly. "Falco, report!" Galileo was already there. He moved like a shadow, flowing under the giant's clumsy swing. His arm shot up, the long blade of his knife sinking to the hilt in the thinner plating at the creature's primary arm joint. He twisted the blade and ripped it free. The hegemon roared, a sound of shock and pain, and its rifle arm went limp, the weapon clattering to the floor. Before the roar had fully died, Galileo's blade slid silently and with brutal finality into the soft vent under its jaw. Another heavy, meaty slump. Its white-hot form dimmed on their imagers as it fell. The third turned, finally realizing the sound wasn't an accident. It raised its weapon, pointing it blindly into the monochrome darkness, a futile gesture of defiance. Thump. Scott put a round through its neck vent. It crumpled without a sound. 3 8-foot-tall engines of war, dead in less than 10 seconds. The deep quiet that followed was heavier than the darkness, broken only by the faint, distant hiss of escaping atmosphere somewhere in the station's wounded guts. Back on the bridge, the only light came from the single battery-powered lamp Cora had rigged to her console. Scott leaned over the central schematic screen, which now showed a simple floor plan of their ship and the immediate docking area. "All right," he said, his voice a low, controlled whisper that carried perfectly over their private comms. Rule 1, they're blind, but not deaf. We use their noise to cover ours. No talking unless it's over this channel. Rule 2, they're pack animals. They'll group up. We keep them separated, panicked, and paranoid. He looked at Galileo, who was wiping his knife clean on the leg of his trousers. The big man gave a single sharp nod. He was already moving toward the main corridor, his destination a choke point at the junction of 2 service tunnels, a place they had used 100 times in drills. He was the anchor, the wall. Scott turned his attention to the others. Cora, you're our eyes and ears. Their main comms are fried, but they'll be shouting. Use the ship's external mics to track them. Ping us their locations on the map. Already on it, Skipper, Cora whispered back, her fingers dancing across a datapad, her face illuminated by its glow. I'm picking up a lot of panicked yelling. It's like a horror movie hotline where the monsters are calling for help. Finch, Scott said, looking toward the ceiling hatch where she had reappeared. A silent shadow in the dark. Be a ghost. Get back in the vents. You're not looking for kills. You're our psychological warfare division. Make them jumpy. Make them see things that aren't there. Make them paranoid. A grin flashed in the darkness from above. Make them piss their giant space pants, Finch's voice chirped in their ears. Got it. Going full poltergeist. The hatch cover slid silently back into place, and she was gone, a phantom returning to her domain. Finch moved through the guts of the terminus station like a whisper. The ventilation shafts were her kingdom, a labyrinth of cold metal and echoing silence that she knew better than anyone. Below her, through the grates, she watched the hunters become the hunted. A squad of 5 hegemons was clumped together in a service corridor, moving with agonizing slowness. 5 bright white blazing shapes on her thermal imager. They were trying to use touch to navigate, one hand on the wall, the other holding their useless rifles. She pulled a small, heavy metal slug from her belt pouch. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed it down a perpendicular hallway a good 50 meters from the hegemon squad. The clatter, clank, skitter of the slug was an earthquake in the profound stillness. Contact! One of the hegemons bellowed, spinning and firing a brilliant blue bolt of plasma down the empty hallway. The bolt illuminated nothing but a bare wall before dissipating. The other 4, startled by the sudden noise and light, followed his lead, unleashing a volley of fire at a sound. Finch grinned in the dark. They were shooting at echoes. But she could do better. She crawled on, deeper into the network, her movements swift and silent. She found what she was looking for, a terminal controlling the pressure release valves for the sector's atmospheric recyclers. An independent failsafe circuit, too primitive to be affected by the EMP. Her fingers flew across the keypad. 100 meters away from the jumpy hegemon squad, a pressure valve hissed open with a loud, sustained psss. There, to the right, another hegemon shouted, firing blindly in the direction of the new sound. It's in the walls, a third screamed, his voice pitching high with panic. He fired a wild shot straight into the ceiling, the plasma bolt ricocheting with a terrifying screech. Hold your fire, you idiots! Their leader commanded, but his voice was tight with a fear he couldn't conceal. You're wasting energy! Finch slithered away, a silent laugh shaking her body. She wasn't just marking targets, she was creating ghosts. She was turning the station itself into a haunted house, weaponizing the architecture against its invaders, and the hegemons were its terrified, unwilling guests. Scott held up a hand, a gesture rendered in the stark silhouette of his thermal optics. He stopped Galileo in the shadow of a large cargo container. Ahead, a wide causeway connecting 2 sections of the docking bay was blocked by a hegemon patrol. 4 of them, sweeping the area with their useless rifles, their white-hot forms a cluster of confusion. Cora, Scott whispered into his comm, his breath fogging slightly in the cold air. Environmental advantages. See that big, ugly piece of machinery on the left? Cora's voice came back instantly, calm and clear in his ear. T7 industrial scrap compactor. Its hydraulics run on a single-use high-capacity capacitor bank. Independent circuit. One big squeeze and it's done for the day. Should be shielded. Scott spotted it, a monstrous assembly of gears and pistons with two massive serrated plates of steel forming a deadly maw. "Finch, you see them?" "Like 4 burning candles in a cave," she replied from her unseen perch. "What's the plan?" "Get them in the middle of it," Scott ordered. "Make a sound. Draw them in." A few seconds later, a sharp bang echoed from the far side of the compactor, a sound Finch made by slamming a heavy vent cover against its frame. As predicted, the 4 hegemons cautiously advanced into the compactor's kill zone to investigate, their movements clumsy and uncertain. They bunched up, seeking safety in numbers, directly between the 2 press plates. "Galileo," Scott said. Galileo didn't need to be told. He was already holding a heavy magnetic breaching charge, its surface cold in his hand. Cora's voice came over the comm, sharp and intense. "Override is hot. You've got a 2-second window once I drop the safeties. Now!" Galileo's arm whipped forward. The charge sailed through the air in a perfect silent arc, striking the compactor's energy activation plate with a loud clang that echoed through the cavernous space. The 4 hegemons spun toward the new sound, their weapons raising, but it was too late. A horrifying shriek of tortured metal filled the air as the scrap compactor roared to life. 2 massive plates of steel slammed together with inconceivable force. The hegemon patrol was caught directly in their path. There was just a monstrous wet crunch, a sound of immense pressure meeting yielding flesh and bone, followed by the gruesome, thick drip of cooling liquid onto the deck. The press shuddered, then retracted with another groan, leaving the causeway horribly, perfectly clear. "Subtle," French deadpanned over the comm. "Effective," Galileo grunted. "Let's move," Scott ordered, already pushing forward. "The main event is about to start." Commander Harith stood amidst the growing chaos, his 4 eyes uselessly scanning the swirling thermal fog. Rage, hot and pure, burned through his fear, cauterizing it. These humans. This wasn't a tactical maneuver. This was cowardice. They were hiding in the dark like vermin. His arrogance proved a false, fatal clarity. What would a terrified creature do? It would run for safety. It would run for the light. He was certain. The humans' only logical goal was to get to the Sector Epsilon power control hub and restore the main grid. They weren't hunting his men. They were running a desperate, panicked race to the light switch. "All remaining units," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the dead corridor, a command born of flawed logic. "Converge on the Sector Epsilon power hub. We will set a trap and crush them when they show themselves." He wouldn't be the hunted. He would be the trapper, waiting for his frightened prey to stumble into his claws. Cora intercepted the shouted commands through a hardwired external microphone. "He's falling back to the power hub," she relayed to Scott. "He thinks you're running there." She paused, her voice hardening. "And he just gave a final order. If he doesn't report success in 15 minutes, his second-in-command on the cutter is to purge the chamber, trigger the emergency coolant flush." "Scorched earth," Scott growled. "He'd rather freeze his own men than admit he was outsmarted?" "Let's make sure he's the first one in it," Finch's voice cut in, sharp as broken glass. As they moved through a final narrow access corridor leading to the upper levels of the power hub, Galileo silently reached out and tapped Finch on the shoulder. He held out a pair of heavy-duty mag clips. She looked at them, then at Galileo, then at Scott, who glanced up at the unseen ceiling of the massive chamber ahead. She understood instantly and took them with a grateful nod. It was a silent conversation, a plan formed and acknowledged in a shared glance and a simple gesture. They entered the power control hub from a high gantry, arriving a crucial 10 minutes before Harith's main force. The hub was a cavern, an industrial cathedral built to honor energy, now a lightless abyss of silent machinery. For 10 minutes, they turned it into a death trap. Galileo, moving with a quiet, deadly purpose, planted small, concussive charges at key structural points on the gantries and walkways, with Scott pointing out weaknesses with a simple hand signal. Cora, from the Rogue Star, designated electronic lures they could activate on command, and Finch, using the mag clamps, sealed a massive vertical power conduit, a white-hot specter ascending into the high, oppressive darkness. Harith and his final squadron of 20 enforcers entered from the lowest level, their heavy boots clanging on the metal deck. "Spread out! Find cover!" Harith bellowed. "Aim for any heat source that isn't one of ours! They are here!" Cora smiled grimly and pressed a virtual button on her data pad. A sound lure activated, the distant click whine of a human pulse rifle being charged, echoing from an empty corner of the chamber. "There!" Harith roared. "Fire!" His soldiers unleashed a storm of blue plasma into the empty corner, the fusillade deafening themselves to all other sounds and filling the chamber with the roar of their own weapons. While they were distracted, Galileo triggered his first charge. A concussive blast erupted on a gantry directly above them, showering them with non-lethal debris but creating a terrifying new sound from a new direction. They spun, firing wildly at the new noise. From his high perch, concealed behind a massive turbine, Scott's rifle thumped 3 times, the suppressive shots lost in the cacophony. Below, 3 hegemons crumpled to the ground, their white-hot signatures flickering out like snuffed candles. Before the others could react, Finch, clinging to her conduit high above, dropped a concussion charge into the center of their formation. The device detonated not with a flash, but with a skull-rattling crack of pure sound and overpressure. It wasn't designed to kill, it was designed to disorient. The deafened, stunned hegemons stumbled into total chaos, their formation broken, their senses overwhelmed. It was a turkey shoot. From above, Scott's rifle continued its methodical work, each thump a death sentence. On the ground, Galileo emerged from the shadows of a massive pillar, his combat knife a blur of brutal close-quarters destruction. The hegemons were being dismantled, picked off one by ghosts they couldn't see and sounds they couldn't comprehend. In seconds that stretched into an eternity, it was over. The echoes of plasma fire faded, replaced by the heavy quiet of the grave. Only one heat signature remained: Harith. He stood alone amidst the bodies of his soldiers, their forms already cooling, fading into the gray background of his useless vision. "Show yourselves, cowards!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a rage that was indistinguishable from terror. He fired his rifle blindly into the oppressive darkness. The plasma bolt streaked across the vast chamber, and for a split second, the flash illuminated the silhouette of a human figure on a high gentry. Scott. Then darkness swallowed him again. Harith roared and fired again and again, a futile gesture against the ghosts in the machine. He lowered his weapon, panting, the hot barrel the only clear thing in his vision. He saw the heat signature of one of his fallen guards finally fade completely, its warmth bleeding into the cold deck, vanishing from his sight. It was the last thing he ever saw clearly. A sound made him freeze, a soft click directly in front of him. He looked down. In the featureless swirling blanket of his vision, a new heat source flared into existence. 2 small, defined circles of warmth, and behind them, a faint, eerie green glow, the lenses of a thermal imager, warmed by the face of a human wearing them. A single, suppressed thump. Commander Harith crumpled to the floor, his life's heat already beginning its slow journey into the cold, indifferent metal. "All right, Cora." Scott's voice was steady in the quiet aftermath, the calm after the perfect, violent storm. "Give us some light, just the essentials." A few amber maintenance lights flickered on one by one, casting long, eerie shadows across the cavern of the dead. The 4 humans gathered their gear, their movements economical and weary, and walked out of the tomb they had created. They emerged from the service corridor back into the main docking bay. The minimal power was enough to bring up the bay's dim yellow work lights, painting the scene in jaundiced, sickly hues. And they weren't alone. Dozens of other scavengers, mechanics, and traders had crept out of their holes, drawn first by the violent docking, then the terrifying silence, and now the tentative return of light. They were lining the walls of the docking bay, their faces a mixture of confusion, awe, and a deep primal fear. They had all seen the Cinder hegemony's finest cutter dock. They had all heard the initial firefight, a sound that usually meant death or enslavement for anybody who got in the way. And then they had all been plunged into the deepest, most absolute dark they had ever known. Now, out of that darkness, 4 figures walked. As they moved into the dim light, the onlookers could see the faint ghostly green glow emanating from the optics covering their faces. They walked with a calm, quiet purpose, not looking at the gawking crowd, their path taking them back toward their vessel and toward the captured hegemony patrol ship docked beside it. As the 4 figures passed, the crowd of onlookers didn't cheer or question. They flattened themselves against the walls. They shrank back, their eyes wide. They had seen more than 40 of the hegemony's best soldiers, renowned throughout the outer arms for their brutality and prowess, go in. They saw 4 sets of green lights come out. In the neon and shadow hellscape of Terminus Station, a place built on reputation and brutal calculus, that was all anyone needed to know. The whispers had already begun, spreading from bay to bay, from cantina to workshop, a new legend being forged in real time. Fear the humans, fear the green-eyed ghosts, the weak-eyed race who'd owned the dark. The blast door of the Rogue Star hissed shut, sealing them inside a sanctuary of worn metal and familiar silence. The ghostly green glow of their optics vanished as they flipped them up, one by one. Finch dropped from the ceiling hatch, landing with a soft thud, a wide, feral grin splitting her face. The tremor of fear she'd felt in the vents was gone, blurred away and replaced by the pure, humming energy of the Predator. "I think I made one of them scream," she said, her voice buzzing. "Heard it right through the grate, a high-pitched one." Galileo didn't say a word, just methodically wiped his long knife clean before sheathing it with a definitive click. The sound, a final percussive end to the violence. Across the bridge, Cora was laughing. A real, unrestrained laugh that held no trace of her usual sarcasm. She spun in her chair, pointing a triumphant finger at the tactical display. 53 signals went in, she announced, her voice ringing with pure, unadulterated pride. 0 came out! 0! Scott leaned back against the command console, the rigid tension finally leaving his shoulders. He watched them, his family, his crew, and allowed himself a small, sharp, proud smile. He looked from face to face, Finch's manic energy, Cora's fierce joy, Galileo's unshakable calm. They had been cornered, outgunned, and facing certain death. Now they were legends, their story already spreading throughout the station like wildfire. Harith's final fatal mistake was assuming that because human eyes were limited, so were human minds. He never considered that for humanity, a disadvantage was never a roadblock. It was simply a new, more interesting direction from which to attack. Let the galaxy call their eyes weak. They would learn. Humanity had spent millennia turning night into day with nothing but a spark, and they had just reminded the universe that they were more than happy to do it the other way around.